One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is how many women quietly move through midlife feeling emotionally flatter than they used to, but they don't always recognize what's actually happening because life still looks relatively functional from the outside. You're still going to work, handling responsibilities, paying your bills, taking care of other people, and still doing all the things that need to get done every day, which makes it very easy to assume you're fine simply because you're functioning. And honestly, maybe part of you thinks you should feel fine too. But then there's these quieter moments that start happening where you realize something internally feels different than it used to. You sit down at the end of the day hoping to finally relax, and instead of feeling settled, your body feels tired while your mind still feels active. Or maybe you noticed that things which once felt exciting, creative, or emotionally energizing don't quite land the same way anymore. They're not gone completely, but they feel quieter somehow. I've had moments sitting on the couch lately at night after everything finally calms down where I realize I don't actually feel mentally rested, even though I'm technically resting. The house is quiet, the dogs are nearby, nothing stressful is actively happening, but internally, part of my brain is still moving, thinking about unfinished work, future plans, business ideas, my responsibilities, things I need to remember tomorrow, whether I'm moving fast enough toward my goal, whether I'm making smart decisions, and whether I'm doing enough with the time I have. And after enough years of living with that kind of constant internal movement, I honestly think it starts changing the emotional experience of your life in ways people don't talk about enough. Most conversations about midlife tend to stop at stress, burnout, or hormones, even though I think there's a much bigger neurological and emotional picture happening underneath all three. The human nervous system was never really designed to stay in a constant state of mental management for years without consequence. And I think that's exactly where many women end up by midlife. Adulthood slowly trains people to stay internally on almost all the time. The brain stays busy, constantly remembering things, anticipating future problems, mentally organizing responsibilities, monitoring how everyone else is doing emotionally, and quietly trying to keep life functioning smoothly in the background all day long. Over time, that level of constant cognitive load changes the nervous system in ways most people don't fully recognize while it's happening. There's actually research behind this too. When the brain spends long periods of time in a state of chronic vigilance and anticipation, it gradually shifts towards efficiency and threat monitoring instead of openness and emotional spaciousness. Stress hormones like cortisol were originally designed to help human beings survive long term danger, but many modern adults experience low grade activation for years after a time without enough true recovery in between. Eventually, the body adapts to that state, which is part of what makes this so difficult to recognize. People stop noticing how mentally overloaded they are because the overload itself starts feeling normal. I think that's one of the reasons emotional flatness can feel so confusing during midlife. Nothing necessarily looks wrong from the outside, and in many cases, life is technically stable. But internally, the brain has spent so many years prioritizing management, efficiency, anticipation, and emotional responsibility that presence starts getting crowded out. And presence is where people actually experience joy. The brain cannot stay heavily future oriented all the time and fully present at the same time. Neurologically, attention keeps getting redirected towards prediction, planning, preparing, and problem solving. That's useful when life genuinely requires management, but over long periods of time, it can create this strange feeling where life starts feeling more managed than deeply experienced. You're still moving through your routines and responsibilities, functioning, and still accomplishing things, but there's less emotional spaciousness inside the experience of loving your life. And I think many women interpret that feeling incorrectly. They assume they need more discipline, motivation, productivity, or more self improvement, when the issue may actually be that the nervous system has been overloaded for too long without enough restoration. There's also growing research showing that chronic stress affects emotional range, attention, memory, creativity, and even the brain's reward systems. During long periods of overload, the brain naturally starts conserving energy and narrowing focus, which is part of why emotionally exhausted people often stop reaching for things that once felt playful, restorative, or creatively fulfilling. It's not always lazy, and it's not always depression either. Sometimes the nervous system is simply prioritizing survival and efficiency over exploration and emotional openness. I think that's why so many women describe feeling emotionally muted during this season of life, not devastated or hopeless, but flatter somehow. And honestly, hormones can absolutely amplify this experience too. During perimenopause and menopause, fluctuating estrogen levels can affect sleep quality, mood regulation, stress resilience, memory, and cognitive clarity. Poor sleep alone changes emotional regulation significantly because the brain processes emotional stress differently when it's sleep deprived. And add chronic stress, constant mental load, digital overstimulation, future planning, financial pressure, and years of accumulated responsibility on top of hormonal shifts, and it makes sense that many women start feeling emotionally exhausted in ways they struggle to fully explain. The body is carrying a lot, the brain is carrying a lot, and eventually emotional energy starts narrowing. I notice this conversation happening more frequently now because so many women quietly feel guilty for not feeling happier during midlife. They look at their lives logically and think, my life is okay. I should feel grateful. Other people have bigger problems. And gratitude absolutely matters. But gratitude and nervous system exhaustion can exist at the same time. I also think modern life makes this worse in ways people underestimate. The human brain was never designed to absorb this much stimulation, information, comparison, decision making, and attention switching every single day. Constant phone checking alone keeps many nervous systems in a low grade state of activation because the brain never fully settles into stillness long enough to recover. There's research showing that attention residue builds when people continuously switch tasks or rapidly shift focus throughout the day. Part of the brain remains partially attached to previous mental tasks, which increases cognitive fatigue over time. And I think many adults now live in a nearly constant state of fragmented attention without fully realizing how mentally exhausting that actually is. That's part of why quiet moments often feel emotionally significant during midlife. For a few minutes, the nervous system finally has a chance to soften because the brain stops scanning for the next thing long enough to actually settle. And suddenly you notice yourself feeling present again. Not because something dramatic happened, but because your system finally experienced a small moment of recovery. I've realized lately that the moments that feel most grounding to me are incredibly simple moments that earlier versions of me probably would have rushed right past. Quiet mornings, wind moving through the trees, walking the dogs without rushing, looking out at the mountain view and actually letting myself pause long enough to fully take it in. Those moments matter more than people realize because they interrupt the constant mental management many adults have been running for years. And honestly, I think that's one of the deeper invitations of midlife. Not necessarily to accomplish more or optimize yourself further, but maybe to start paying attention to what actually helps your nervous system feel safe enough to soften again. Because feeling emotionally flat sometimes does not mean you are broken, and it does not mean your best years are behind you. Sometimes it simply means your nervous system has spent too many years carrying chronic mental load, emotional responsibility, overstimulation, anticipation, and intense pressure without enough true restoration in between. That's different. And I think understanding that difference matters. What many women actually need during this season of life is not additional pressure, but more recovery, more emotional spaciousness, and more of movements where life feels experienced again instead of constantly managed. And honestly, I think that may be one of the most important questions midlife quietly asks us if we're willing to listen closely enough. What actually helps me feel emotionally alive again? That's a very different conversation, and maybe one worth sitting with a little longer. This is the Clarity Reset, where we make sense of what's changing so you can move forward with clarity.